your host, Samantha Sitole, and I'm joining you from Harare in Zimbabwe. And I'm so excited to have you at the Trailblazers event on this beautiful day. So, welcome to the Trailblazers Hour. I hope you all are ready for a very exciting African evening. As you can see, I'm wearing my African clothes. I have my earrings. I hope you have your popcorn ready, your tea, coffee, your glass of wine. If that's it's that type of Monday, we understand. Welcome. Just get yourselves comfortable because today is going to be a very interesting day. And so tonight we have our wonderful speaker who is not, he's not just a young man. He's not just a young man, but he is a man who is going to speak about the importance of peace building on the African continent around conservation and the conflicts that arise with our natural resources. And on Saturday is this Africa Day. Africa Day commemorates the creation of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, in 1963, which is now known as the African Union. And it serves as a vital symbol of Pan-Africanism. And one of those things is unity. However, unity cannot be accomplished where there's conflict, where there's strife. And one of the important aspects of today's talk is about peace building in what we know as our natural resources sector. And so the title of this talk today is The Power of Conflict-Sensitive Communication in Conservation. So I'm so excited to introduce to you Tapiwa Prosper Chimbadzwa, joining us from Zimbabwe here in Harare. And he is a peace building professional with over 8 years of experience working across West and Southern Africa at the intersection of climate justice, conservation, governance, faith, and community resilience. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Peace Building, Conflict and Governance, and is currently a Rotary Peace Fellow pursuing a postgraduate diploma in peace building and conflict transformation at Makerere University. His work focuses on inclusive development, community participation, and practical solutions that connect environmental sustainability with peace building. Tapiwa is also leading Back to Eden, a faith-based initiative exploring human-wildlife coexistence in Nyami Nyami. So, Tapiwa, you are so welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. We are so excited to have you. The floor is yours. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen.
All right. Thank you very much, Samantha. It's quite heartwarming to be introduced in such a way, and also to be reminded that I'm a very young person. Thank you very much. So today I'm going to speak more about the power of conflict-sensitive communication in conservation, and to start. I think peace is something that comes from within, and it starts from the person. So I'll start with a question, a reflection question, like what happens when conservation meets conflict, and what comes to your mind when you meet the word conflict? Because I think it's something that most people don't really have a greater appreciation of what really is conflict. And I would like us to start by having this reflection, like the tensions, the emotions, the choices, and most probably the pathways towards coexistence. But it only begins by understanding the concept of conflict and what really happened when conservation meets conflict. So today I would like to invite you all for us to explore this critical but often overlooked idea that the way we communicate in conservation spaces can either build peace or unintentionally fuel conflict. So it's more like saying that the words that we use when we try to conserve has a different bearing on the outcomes in terms of human relations in communities. So for starters, I'm just going to, have a definition of terms, of key terms that we're going to be using throughout this conversation, so that we can all be on the same length. So before I start maybe with the definition of the key terms, I would like us to do a quick reality check. So according to the Institute for Economics and Peace 2025 Global Peace Index, it says that 35 out of 43 sub-Saharan countries are involved in some form of violence or instability, which means that there's conflict. And the IUCN says that you would see that most of the biodiversity rich spaces across the world are experiencing a form of instability, either in form of poverty, inequality, and in worst case scenarios, violent and armed conflict. So you start to think of how then do we navigate conservation in such spaces where there is so much tensions rising. And I would start by maybe defining conflict in this context. And I would want us to mainly focus on the keywords that I'm going to point out. So from the definition that I got from Joan Gautang, it says that conflict is a disagreement or a clash between individuals or groups arising from a real or a perceived difference in interest, values, or access to resources. But mainly, what I want us to focus on more is to think around what really causes conflict. And it's a matter of interest, either they are real or perceived. And this is what then emanates into conflict. And um, conservation, I think I'm not going to do much into defining conservation, but I'm also just going to break down the conflict sensitive communication as an approach that recognizes how communication can either escalate or reduce tensions. So this is like a way of communicating. In Shona, we usually, my native language, we say mindronyoro inopoza hasha, which means a very calm response calms down the anger. So this is the whole concept of conflict sensitive communication. So in this context, I wanted to us to have a deeper conversation on conflict and its layers in communities that we work with, especially when it comes to conservation. And I think there is one issue that has been very prominent, especially in the 21st century, where people have been talking about human or life conflict. What happens when humans and and wildlife interact? And most often, there has been recordings, reports of negative interactions and incidents that we mostly see, the crop raids, um, the deep animal predation, and even cases of people losing their lives. And analyzing it from the basis of a human wildlife conflict iceberg, I would like to call it, is like the tip. From the tip, you what you see, what is visible is what's really happening on the ground, and then deep down there are so many layers to the conflict. And in most senses it speaks to the deeper dynamics. And that's why I wanted to then talk about conflict dynamics, understanding what really are conflict dynamics. And in this context, conflict dynamics refers to the evolving patterns, interactions, and emotions and behaviors between parties during disputes. And you would start to think of what really happens when there is a conflict. In most cases, people tend to want to ignore the idea of emotions being put into the issues around conflict. And sometimes it's more about what someone felt after what happened more than what really happened. And there are very two um, important key things that we need to think about when you think of conflict in the sense of conservation, or conflict in the basic sense that it is something that is based on emotions and relations. And once relations are done, then we are bound to see the visible part of the conflict. But also there are some things that are unspoken. That's why we really need now to think of and talk about conflict sensitive communication, how communication can be used as a tool to de-escalate conflict, especially in conservation spaces. So usually the management of natural resources is often conflictual, given that most cases, like conservationists, tend to try and reconcile competing and sometimes incompatible interests. For example, we are talking about livelihood and protection of nature, and usually there is always that issue of tension. That's why then we then need to talk about why do we really need then to communicate in a way that is more um, intentional, and that really builds relationship between communities and conservationists. So from the slide that you're looking at, I tried to put into place like what what is conflict sensitive communication? Why does it really matter? And how does it look like in terms of when it's in practice? And why communities should then practice it? But I would like to more dwell much on a more practical basis in terms of um, the project that I'm implementing in Nyami Nyami, where we are talking about Back to Eden, which is more of uh, a faith-based approach to human life coexistence, and it's built on the basis that people really need to be communicated with in a more familiar moral framework, something that they can really resonate with, because um, from the findings and interaction that I've been having, and through this project and through my work within the space of conservation, I've literally seen that in most cases, communities are communicated to in the most complicated jargons of conservation, that they don't really understand where they are coming from, where it's going, and it's usually then that confusion. It gives space and room for people to then interpret things the way they want to interpret it, and gives room for issues, yeah, for issues such as rumors to then spread, and then that then leads to resistance, mistrust, and in worst cases, it can actually lead to open conflict that can lead to losses for both humans, wildlife, and property. So you'd see it that in this sense, there is need now to be very much intentional when designing conservation initiative, to actually involve communities from the basis. And by saying conservation, conflict sensitive communication, what do I then mean on the ground when it comes to these key practical issues? I mean, there is a really need for inclusion of communities from the onset of planning um, um, conservation projects. Like we should cease from those tick box practices, but there is really need for real engagement with communities, real consultation. So I'll give you a hypothetical scenario where you know a certain protected area thought of reintroducing zebras into the park, but they decided not to consult the communities, and then the zebras were now being hunted by the lions, and they decided to run away, and they moved straight into the communities. And then, whilst they moved straight into the communities, then the lions then followed in to the communities and started, predating on livestock, which then became a heated conflict. And in that sense, you would see that communities started complaining. But the way the message was sent out in this scenario is like the community, with all the anger, it came through and said, your animals are attacking our animals, and then the response from the other side is that you are the one who came to reside where there are animals. In this scenario, if you were to be one of um, one from one person from the other side, how does that make you feel when you are being communicated to in such a way? So this is like what I then call conflict sensitive. The need for this then brings about the need for conflict sensitive communication, to say that before you communicate, the words that you're going to use, think about how is it going to make the next person feel, and is it going to build relations or rather worsen the situation. So you'd see that in this context, communication is not just information sharing, but rather meaningful and respectful and inclusive uh, sharing and dissemination of information. And also, um, whilst you're doing that, we should be able to ask ourselves three very important questions, right? The first one is, are we listening to communities? Because I believe that communication is not only about, disseminating the information. It also takes you listening to the information that is coming from the people. And the second thing is, are we really valuing the local knowledges and practices? Because it's often at times, as conservationists, we tend to dwell much on science-based approaches and then overlook the local practices and knowledge that is within, and then that creates a form of clash. And then the last question would be, are we speaking in the ways that resonate well with local communities? Because I believe that communication isn't something neutral, but it shapes the relationships between people, and how it's sent out is very important. And why then do we really need to think about conflict sensitive communication? It's hinges upon one of the most basic principle of conflict sensitivity, which is do no harm. So in whatever you do and however you do it, you should make sure that you think about, am I not doing harm to these communities? Am I not doing harm to myself or the people that I'm interacting with? From the slide that I'm sharing, you can actually see that I try to make sure that I show you like the implications of poor communication in conservation efforts and what it really brings about. And you'd see that the first thing that is broken down is trust amongst the conservation practitioners and the communities. And where trust is dead, that means the relationships are dead. So it then means that when you need communities to play their part, when you need to bring about cooperation, there is no cooperation. And then the second thing is that information, when you don't give information to the people in a way that they understand and be able to interpret, they get the information from somewhere, and that's where you start to see issues around misinformation and rumor spreading, and there is need for one to actually de-escalate and deal with those issues. And then there's also the other issue of increased human or wildlife conflict, I think, and then exclusion of local knowledge in the context of communication. If the communication doesn't really speak to the people on the ground, it also brings about different challenges. So I think from the lower slides, it also shows like the different scenarios of how poor communication escalates conflicts and how effective communication de-escalates conflicts. So I would speak also from another scenario where a local community um, conservation wanted to introduce, collars as a way to monitor and uh, provide early warning systems for communities in terms of reducing livestock predation. And within the community, the rumor that started to spread out was that the callers are the ones that they would then use to direct animals to the community, which means there is a gap that people don't have a clear understanding of what callers are and how do they work. And this conservation organization then chipped in by doing a very massive community conservation awareness where they brought the callers to the community themselves, talk to them, educate them forward. What are callers? How do they work and how they do? And it took them to actually, try to use people to get the person to get the collar, put it on them, and then tell them move away from this. And then, do you feel anything from the collar? Does anything happen to you? And then demystify everything which was there. From there, that built a form of trust, and then people had an understanding of what really the collar is all about, and then the conservation action then went on. So this is how then conflict sensitive communication comes into play. It also hinges upon conservationists understanding the historical background within the communities, the power dynamics, the existing tensions in the history of what has been happening in communities so that they will be able to actually, when they send a message will get to the people and people will get to understand it and get to also give feedback. But I also believe and understand that sometimes the most powerful communication is simply just creating space for people to be heard. Because in most instances, communities feel like they are not being heard enough. So if you are able to create a space where you can interact with people, get to them to say what they feel and what is happening, and create a feedback loop, then that can easily create better ways. So I finished on my slide. I wanted this to be more of a conversation rather than a presentation, because I believe that issues around communication, it goes back and forth. And but before I leave, I wanted us to then do a reflection of how can communication become a tool for coexistence in the communities that we work with. And I would also want us to think about the need to move away from, the idea of protecting nature from people, and instead work on protecting nature with people. So I think with that, I then leave the room open to have more of a discussion rather than a presentation. So thank you very much, Samantha.
Thank you so much, Tapiwa. That was such a beautiful, heartwarming presentation and talk about your experiences and the work that you've been doing, especially the examples that you gave regarding conflict and the types of conflict, as well as the definition. You set the scene really well. And, you took us through a journey in terms of trying to understand what it looks like to create peace in these conflict ridden spaces. What I really picked up from your talk, some of the nuggets. I mean, you had a lot of them, but one was that uh, do no harm when it comes to communication. Do no harm, and that the three things that you said: conflict sensitive communication, understanding the historical context, and creating space for people in the communities to be heard. And you said, interestingly, that you're not trying to protect nature from people, but you're trying to protect nature with people. So it's a collaborative process that needs to be done in order for communities and wildlife to coexist in a meaningful way. So I want to open it to the floor. I don't want to take up space here because you said create space to be heard. So I want to create space for all of you here this evening, as Tapiwa has charged us to do. And the question he rightfully asked us is how can we communicate? Sorry, how can communication become a tool for coexistence rather than escalation? So, if you would like to answer that question, if you'd like to answer that, okay, great. Thank you, Ayabare Dora. Please unmute. You are welcome.
Thank you. A very good evening to you all. My name is Dora from Uganda. I work as a conservation education assistant for the Uganda Wildlife Authority, and I'm so much engaged in community awareness as well as engagement. So the current presenter, I was really excited to hear what you're talking about. Mine may not be really directly answering the question, but just adding on a few things and agreeing on a number of things as well. So I believe in the bottom top approach, especially when it comes to conflict management. We have different levels of planning when it comes to this management, the management of wildlife or conservation. Even if it comes to the different countries, you have the national level, you have the district level, then you have the local level. So you find that each level has its ways of doing stuff. But when it comes to stakeholder engagement in conservation, it is very, very key because these are the people who are living with nature. And trust me, with the current growing populations against the natural resources, which are not increasing but rather than depreciating, you expect conflicts. As I speak today in my country, sorry about this. As I speak in my country, some drivers were driving through the park, and all of a sudden, the elephant knocked them down. This is not good news for us. And of course, people come back to us and they are, backlashing. Communication in itself, how do we communicate in this scenario? You find that, yes, you may have to go on the ground and try to, calm the situation. On our side, what we are doing, there is what we call the communication can come in handy with solutions because people want to hear solutions rather than hear you talk and talk and talk. What are you bringing on the ground? The elephants have gone to their gardens. What are you doing about it? They are angry and they have to, you have to have ways. So some of the ways we are engaging, we have things like using the digital platforms right now. I wanted to go by example, digital platforms, for example. Right now, the trends are on TikTok, Instagram, and we are tapping into that kind of environment to get attached to the young people and other people are around so that they understand what is going on. And the other one, we are looking at uh, coming to the religious leaders, culture leaders, you get to the bottom of the people. The schools, you go to the schools and communicate this message. For instance, right now we have been in the field talking about introduction of rhinos back in the wilderness of Uganda. And the first thing before we introduced these rhinos was to go to the communities, look for the district local leaders, look for the schools, look for the communities, get down and engage them. So, like you said, for the zebras, they were right to kick them out. I mean, they would have quarreled. There was a step which was missed. You look at things like uh, using the young people to speak to the adults. Like when you're mother, for those who are mothers, when your child comes back home, you're asking, how was the day? What did you study? Then the child can tell you, did you know that teacher Dora just told me that when you hunt an animal, when you kill in Uganda, they fine you 1 billion Ugandan shillings. Daddy, I don't want you to go to prison. So if the parent is not aware, it is at this point that they can listen to the parent. And there is also what we call regular meetings. Let us not come at the last minute when people are having problems. Always go back all the time, all the time. Visit in times when they don't need you, in times when they need you. Do not show up at the times when the elephants have killed people. Then you are coming to tell them about, a lot of things. but just those regular meetings coming to the people all the time can help them build confidence in you. And also, when you're having those regular meetings, you communicate what are the current trends, what is happening. We are yet to bring lions back in the wilderness. What do you think? You see this and this. This is how you will benefit. People are going to benefit this way. For me, I say that when you attach value to biodiversity, people will always appreciate. People want to hear, when I have to conserve these lions, how am I benefiting? I have not gone to school. I'm disabled. How am I benefiting? That is how we come up with livelihood projects to engage our people so that they attach this elephant with something good in their life. And it's working apparently, only that resources are limiting on our side. So when we talk about conservation, it is more of, you are not saying you're protecting people away from using the resource, but rather use it sustainably and enjoy it. And that is how we are going to manage it. Though the resources are not enough, population is increasing, resources are being depleted, pollution is going on, waste management, other other things are coming on board. So how you communicate, I agree with the speaker, but you have to come with solutions to the challenges. That is one. You have to have ways. You have to go with the trends. Otherwise, you lose it out. So for me, I believe that once you have that kind of engagement, you may have all the best solutions, but even the way you deliver them matters. Who is delivering them? Apparently, we have the law enforcement, but these days we are saying, oh, look here, the law enforcement, let us first put it aside because it is more of a gun. People, when they say a law enforcer, they say gun, killing, shooting, they are not pleased. So let us use a carrot to come in front of you and just give you a carrot with, the friendliness as we have dialogues. So that's my submission. Thank you so much.
Oh, Dora, you could have been a speaker yourself. Well, thank you so much for that answer. Thank you. I can even see Tapira nodding. Thank you so much for that answer and for taking us through also your context and your experiences. I think that's very important to share. At that level and at that answer Tapiwa's question, how can communication become a tool for coexistence rather than escalation? What is your take on that? Is it a tool that we can use? Is it really something that we can use? Do you agree with Tapiwa? Maybe you disagree. It's also okay. You don't have to agree with everything the speaker is saying.
I am Jay. I'm Filipino, but I'm based in Uganda, where I just finished my Rotary Peace Fellowship. I'm not sure which cohort Tapiwa belongs to, but I knew about this because I'm a Rotary Peace Fellow also. Congratulations, first of all, to Tapiwa. My submission to, especially to the question, is that first of all, we have to recognize that we have to be very grateful when there is communication to begin with, because it means that we are not fighting or we're not killing each other. So that is to be recognized. But again, as Tapiwa, as Sam, as also Dora have highlighted, the quality of communication is very important. So just to highlight what Tapiwa mentioned is that the creation of space to be heard. So instead of a debate, for example, wherein people really don't necessarily listen because they just want to send their message across, but a dialogue instead, which is more oriented towards listening and trying to understand the other's perspective, for example. And some people are sometimes responding in order to, again, to put their message across and not really to understand or to listen to the other. And give space also for disagreements also. So conflicts, if not violent, are natural and healthy also. So it's also very important to recognize that we may be different, as Tapiwa also defined conflict in the sense that we may have real or perceived differences, but that space for listening, that space for understanding when we do our communication would allow for us to understand each other. And just lastly, Dora mentioned about bringing solutions also. And one thing important to add to that is that aside from the experts or the ones, facilitating the dialogue or the projects, coming with the solutions, it is also important, again, to go back to that space to listen to the communities coming up with their own solutions, because this would make the project, the solutions, the impact more sustainable. Yes. Thank you again, and congrats, Tapiwa.
Thank you so much, Jay, and thank you for bringing us that at your submission. It's actually very interesting, this discussion, because as you said, conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily bad, but it shows areas of challenges or tension that need probably further investigation and further work in collaboration, especially where the communities are concerned. So I think it's also something that we can think about when we're thinking about conflict. Mukululi Hondo says, I'm not able to raise my hand, but my main submissions are on the historical aspect. Okay, great. We should consider that this community we are talking about coexisted with this wildlife. The project is for us to go back to our indigenous knowledge systems, take them and employ them in the current situation. Shared knowledge is the best. I absolutely agree with you. Shared knowledge is the best. That's the co-creation of knowledge with communities. Oftentimes, and I think we've seen that in projects that have perhaps previously failed, is where communities have not been correctly or extensively engaged with, and project partners, especially that those that are who do not understand the context, come into the area, and when they come into the area, they don't know the historical context that exists, or the historical knowledge that the people have about the area, about how they've engaged with wildlife or the national park or whatever it is to begin with. And that then creates tensions, because the communities themselves will have certain ways of wanting to do things, right? That they themselves know because of their historical knowledge, their cultural heritage, etc., or practices, that when projects come in, they're not sensitive to or aware of. And that also creates conflict, especially when projects are generated and money is supposed to be distributed. And it's very important what you've said in Kululi, that indigenous knowledge should probably be at the forefront of any type of project, especially with regards to wildlife, where they've previously coexisted with wildlife. Indigenous knowledge of how were these communities functioning prior to these conflicts, and perhaps digging those up and trying to create solutions, perhaps with modern ways. Salah, do you want to go first? Then Dora, I'll come back to you.
I missed part of the question that Tapiwa asked, but then Mukululi just entered my head, because now I was thinking, what role do indigenous knowledge play in preventing the conflicts? Yeah, so I thought this would be something that I would love to hear from people. Like, what roles do indigenous knowledge have to play when preventing conflict?
Thank you for that question. That's a very good question. I see Tapiwa's back. Tapiwa, do you want to jump in and maybe respond to some of what people have said before I give the floor to Dora, and answer the question that Sela has asked as well?
All right. Sorry, my network is a bit jumpy now, but maybe to respond to some of the things, I think I really do agree with most of the submissions that people were giving. And like what I said, why do we need conflict-sensitive communication in this context? In most cases, the risk that we always have as conservationists is going to communities thinking that we have the solution, yet within the communities lies the solution. That's where there is another layer of conflict, like what I tried to show you through the conflict iceberg, where we then look into the dynamics, what is really happening against the background. Like, okay, fine, sometimes you see it as human wildlife conflict, but in actual context, it's human to human conflict. It's people against people based on certain interests that are being pushed upon. That's why I said in my presentation that natural resource management is often conflictual, because people tend to have different things that are at stake And when we want to protect it, like one of the participants said that, sometimes there is issue of resources, there is issue of economy being in place, and what are the power dynamics at play. But I think I would jump straight into Stella's issue when she raised then the question about indigenous knowledge systems. How does it come to play when it comes to issues around human or life conflict and conflict? I'll give this simple maybe analogy to it, that sometimes most of the conservation solution that we bring, they are not cost efficient, right? For instance, it's like you're bringing a solution that then raises the cost on the communities that are already struggling, yet they had their concept of preserving that they would rather prefer that give them better output and better results. So in that context, there will be a clash, right? So this is how then you treasure human knowledge, you treasure indigenous knowledge systems. I'll give you, for instance, within my project called Back to Eden. Back to Eden, I created what you call a shared creation framework between the Christians and the African traditional region. And one of the major key things that was raised was that the divine mandate for all these believers is that they are stewards of the environment and they have love for nature because nature is part of humanity, and from the ATR aspect is something that is very sacred. So you'd come to think of, if you come to communities and speak to them that let us protect elephants because they are going extinct, there is a higher probability that people don't understand you. But if you say that let's protect elephants because they are part of our identity and them going extinct, which means we have failed, number one, the divine mandate of protecting nature, which is our neighbors. If you look in the Bible, biblical, let's take care of our neighbors. And the neighbor, it extends to say, love your neighbor as you love yourself, which means it extends to our non-human neighbors. That's the indigenous knowledge that's embedded in the communities and how they relate with animals. So a traditional leader actually told me like, okay, fine. You know what? Sometimes back in our time, we used to go and perform rituals, right? So that these interactions cannot become negative, which means they know that when humans and animals meet, there is bound to be negative interaction, but there is a certain cosmological meaning, there's certain spiritual aspect amongst it that is not being done because in the conservation sciences is considered as irrational. It's considered as something that doesn't actually give out the maybe the expected results that people would want to. But for the communities, that works for them. So that's really why I wanted to mainly focus on conflict sensitive communication. Why do we really need to be intentional about the words that we say to the communities and how we interact with them, how we listen to what they are saying, and how do we derive meaning from what they are saying? So that's how then indigenous knowledge system comes into play, because people have ways that they use to interact with wildlife before the coming in of different aspects. So I think if you have further questions on that, maybe I can further clarify.
Thank you so much for that, Tapiwa. I think you touched on a lot of points, especially on your work with the Eden Project about the spirituality, the spiritual aspects around nature, and even our beliefs, whether biblical or African traditional religion, and how that shapes even just like our belief systems, our cultural understandings and practices, but then in essence, how we actually now relate and implement conservation in those spaces. Tapiwa, thank you for the presentation. To me, communication is a two-way, transparent, culturally grounded, and linked to real local benefits, turning communities from bystanders into active custodians of nature. Examples around Bwindi, Impenetrable National Park, Improved engagement through tourism awareness, revenue sharing, and community dialogue, supported by Uganda Wildlife Authority, helped transform earlier resentment into local stewardship for mountain gorillas. In Queen Elizabeth National Park, structured communication with nearby communities introduced mitigation for human-wildlife conflict, reducing retaliation and improving cooperation. In Mabamba wetland, sensitization and ecotourism engagement turned resource users into conservation partners. In Mount Elgon National Park, collaborative management and regular dialogue strengthened compliance and reduced illegal use. I just want to read Morapone's comment here, which says indigenous knowledge systems help prevent conflict by promoting respect, unity, shared responsibility within communities. Values such as Ubuntu encourage people to see themselves as connected to others, which supports empathy and careful behavior. Communication is often indirect and respectful, using proverbs and guidance from elders to avoid confrontation. Communities also prefer dialogue and consensus so that decisions are made together rather than through disagreement. When issues arise, the focus on restoring relationships instead of creating division. Overall, these practices help maintain harmony and reduce conflict by strengthening understanding and cooperation. In the quiet of the wild, we are reminded that life exists beyond noise, pressure, and routine. Encountering wildlife is not only an experience of beauty, but also a lesson in humanity and coexistence. As we step into the world, we learn the importance of respecting their territory, preserving their habitat, and honoring the balance God placed within creation. I really appreciate these responses. Maropane, this is very poetic. Thank you so much for writing it out and showing the value of Ubuntu and how we've coexisted with nature. The way you've written it is very poetic. And I just want to quickly give the floor to Dora before I read the last comment from Kululi. Dora, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you, Samantha. I'm loving all this. I love the communications. These messages I've been reading through. So to add on what has been discussed, colleagues and our guest speaker, a poor community is very hard to speak to, especially that neighboring a conservation area which is not benefiting them. No matter how much you're a good speaker, no matter which methods you're using to communicate to these people, as long as people are very poor, they are hungry, they are not seeing any benefits, they are trying their level means to do their best to grow their crops, and your animals are busy, killing them, eating their animals, eating their crops. Trust me, it is still an issue. They will even go against you. Trust me, they will go against you, even if you are, I don't know who. Those communities tend to be violent. So it goes back to what we have been talking about, the solutions. If you look at someone who was communicating, giving examples from Bwindi, you look at that, there is an attachment of biodiversity value. There are projects being set to make sure that you speak the language they understand, the language of projects to improve their livelihood, the language of solutions to their challenges, the language of listening to them rather than being defensive all the time. So to me, I feel like some of the things like revenue sharing, for a case of our country, we shall tell you, okay, look here, when you conserve, there is this 20% of the get collection which will get back to your community. And people will tell you, we have not seen this money. So it's up to you to go back and trace this money to see that it's working in the community. That's when people will listen. Talking about in terms of resources, please, as conservationists or as people who are communicating to our people, let us give accountability. There is what we call accountability. We are not getting accountable of what is happening. People will see on the news that, let's say, conservation areas are bringing about 15 billion. But they are saying, we are here. Well, how are we benefiting? We hear you're getting a lot of money, but where is that money? So you have to give accountability. People want to know So your communication should come with facts, accountability, solutions, projects, and things. You speak the language they understand. You even have to go as low as going to the local languages. Lower yourself. There are those areas which are so remote that this coming around waving your hair may not work. You come dressed as normally, eat the food they eat so that they understand what you're communicating. So for me, the
Yeah.
way of engagement, the design comes with what is at stake. If
Yes.
you're talking to politicians, the language changes. If you're talking to someone lower, the language will also change. So to me, as a person who is frequent in these community areas, you have to first investigate. You don't just go near people and you want to show off because my dear, some people are dangerous. Communities can be hostile. Then talking about traditions and how are they helping in communication. Um, for us in Uganda, we happen to be lucky. We are more than about 56 tribes, and we have our different cultures, our values, and what do we do. So for us, we even have challenges of tradition against conservation. For example, we find that someone in their family, they are hunters. For us now, we call them poachers. So
A language. Yeah. Exactly.
So these people, you find you're now fighting against poacher. Yes, it is. Yet it is a tradition at home. There are people who believe that when they eat a hippopotamus meat, the women become fertile. Now, I want you guys to keep on thinking how you're going to communicate to these guys. You have someone who believes that when you have a whisker of a lion, you can survive in marriage. So in such cases, how do you come in to handle? And you have to kill such myths. The way you communicate is more of a dialogue and now interpretation of what is going on. Because we shall sit
Yes.
and we say, okay, look here, tell me, how is hippo meat connected with your fertile system? And people have their traditional stories, but you have to kill the myth because now we are in the modern world. Someone will tell you a rhino horn will increase the sexual power. It's an aphrodisiac for the men, but these are rhinos which are getting extinct. So how are you going to come in? For us, on the other positive side, the traditions.
Mm.
For us, totems, we have
Yeah.
what we call beliefs. You find that someone like Dora, I'm from the Cobb family. So anyone touching the Cobb family, we shall not talk very well. It's now the community who will be against their colleagues. Then you find others
Absolutely.
believe
Yeah. Mm.
in a alliance. So you find such attachments on tradition help us to conserve our very own wildlife.
For all the examples that you gave, I can't touch on every point, but really, you brought in some very important points, especially around tradition and accountability. How we're accountable to communities, as well as the traditions and the beliefs that they have concerning certain animals, how they value certain aspects of nature. And what that means, because those ideas and beliefs themselves come in conflict. And I believe where there's people like Tapua mentioned before, there will be conflict because our interests are different, our value systems are different, and our end goal oftentimes is different. I just want to quickly read Mkululi's comment in the chat, and then you're welcome to respond and give us your charge for us this evening. So Mukululi writes, yes, I agree, Tapia. We have the misconception that communities have nothing to do with conservation. We see them as enemies of wildlife, yet we have people who have been conserving these animals. Our totems, they tell us a lot about conservation. Our traditional leaders can spearhead the communication. Moreover, we are to practice our old ways where we used to communicate with elephants, for example. The winds caused by the elephant ears could inform members to change directions. Avoiding conflicts with animals is the first step to avoid conflicts with national parks. And then he says, true, Dora, traditionally the community has been benefiting as they are conserving their resources. They need to continue benefiting through these modern projects. And I think we're touching on valid, similar points here, especially in the comment section. And it's quite it's very interesting to see the interest in the room, and I implore you guys to continue these conversations even outside of the Trailblazers platform. But we welcome you to continue having these conversations. But Tapiwa, before we end the meeting, please, what are your responses to what's been said, and your charge to us before we close?
Yeah, thank you very much, Samantha. I think Dora really raises very interesting um, points, but I think it all begins with people fight what they don't really understand, and the matter of you engaging to people with the key assumption that they are poor is actually the risk of doing no harm. Because what then do you define as success in your context? Like why I said, that's where conflict starts, where you perceive someone as a lesser being because they don't have maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things. That's where the problem starts from. I think that's where we need then to morely invest in knowing the historical context of communities that we work with, the type of people, the power dynamics, the layers within the communities. That way we can able to invest in better dialogue and better communication. Trust me, I've seen people being chased away with matches and other things at first glance, and then later they do agree because of certain perceived perceptions towards them. But when we sit down and have dialogue, that's why I implode the use of conflict sensitive communication in conservation, because these are the realities. Living with wildlife is something that is very cost intensive. And if you have to deal with it, communities are love wildlife, but also they need to think about how best to live with the cost. I'm very happy that in Zimbabwe they have now introduced a new wildlife policy, which have moved away from protecting and enforcing to actually to a community-centered approach to conservation. And one thing that is doing is speaking nature. It's putting communities and people at the center first, and then respond whatever comes later, which was something that the model of conservation that we are using failed to take into cognizance that no life is more important than the other. And often, at times, people felt like wildlife is more being treasured than people as an asset to the country, and people not being an asset. So that really starts a conflict. But as to end this, because we can spend the whole day having this conversation, left, right, and center, but I would really love to engage more with people. I think in my parting words, I would rather say that we really need to invest in building skills on conflict sensitive communication, especially in conservation. And we really need to treasure communication in conservation, because most conservation organizations, they don't invest their budget in communication. They would rather much more money to build solutions that are scientific, to do research, but there is not much intentional attention given towards communication. And then lastly, I'll say that when we speak peace, right, we serve nature more. So instead of going to communities and blame them that you guys are killing this, you guys are doing this, you'd rather go and say, we have a problem as a community, and this is what we are facing. How can we best solve it? Because sometimes what people are just doing in retaliation is because there is no information that have gotten to them, or the kind of information that they have got led to that misinterpretation. That's why I then had to speak about this. But thank you very much for this opportunity to actually have a conversation on conflict. And I think it's something that we really need to keep on ongoing, having a discussion. Thank you, Samantha. Over to you.
Tapiwa, thank you so much. And I absolutely agree. I think the context absolutely matters, and investing in conflict sensitive communication is something that I think we need to push forward in projects that we are a part of, because all of us in our own rights, we have a mantle or a sphere of influence that we are able to influence, our spheres of influence. And that mantle, whether we're in finance, whether we're in communication, whether we're in project development, whatever level you are at in your organization or in the work that you do, you have a space to communicate. You yourself are a person who has power, you have a voice, you have authority in an aspect of your work where you can suggest ideas and say, you know what, I heard a talk from Tapiwa in Zimbabwe, and he works in peace building and conflict sensitive communication and conservation. And I think this would be something that would really benefit our organization or our project. And that is a way in which you bring to the table homegrown solutions, something that you heard that could work in your context, and obviously you tailor it to where you are. Deborah wrote, defining a poor community is more of saying humble community. As a person to intervene, I feel like you have to first know which kind of community you are dealing with. Hence, context matters. What is their source of livelihood? At times, people can hardly put food on their table. That is true, and afford daily basic needs. In our country, as a concerned person, that is the beginning of making a good plan of communication and engagement. Thank you, Tapiwa, and the organizers for this. And so, Tapiwa, his charge to us today is, I will leave the Ubuntu statement. You are because we are. And the way we interact is hinged on the way we communicate. I love that. The way that we interact is hinged on the way we communicate. So as we go, be intentional that as you communicate or implement projects, make sure you do no harm. So thank you so much for this beautiful talk and very insightful, Tapiwa, about doing no harm, about peace building within a very conflict sensitive area, which is conservation. We really appreciate the time you've taken out, and we appreciate each and every one of you who joined us tonight.